Okay, so the section ecumenical meetings. He met with certain highly placed people in the Orthodox hierarchy, thus opening the way to fraternal contacts between East and West, again, meaning between heretics and Catholics. He was the first dignitary of the Catholic Church to visit the celebrated Orthodox monastery of Mount Athos in Greece, which was altogether different from a simple tourist visit. So it's one thing that you might go to see some important historical building that might be, in fact, a place of false worship that in itself is not something to be condemned. There might be reasons to go to such a place, but the way he did it was more than that. It was with the idea of some kind of an ecumenical meeting here. His eyes were already looking at the diversity, this is according to this author, the diversity of Christian churches from an ecumenical perspective. So his visit was clearly with that purpose in mind. The meeting with the members of the Orthodox hierarchy, which had already begun in Bulgaria, multiplied. On March 25th, 1927, there was an interview with the ecumenical patriarch, in quotes, because he's nothing. He's less than a Novus Ordo prelate in terms of jurisdiction, Basil III. So he meets with an ecumenical patriarch. You may remember Bergoglio a number of years ago referring to, I think it was an Anglican as being his brother bishop. That's I think the Archbishop, quote unquote Archbishop of Canterbury. As I recall, there was some instance of his addressing some non-Catholic as a brother bishop. Of course, the irony of it is that neither of them are bishops. Certainly not by power of orders, and in fact, neither, of course, having any jurisdiction at all. And so, we could expound on that. But back to Roncalli here. In 1936, he was present at the funeral of the ecumenical, another patriarch. In this case, the name of the patriarch being Photius II. So the first one was the original 9th century schismatic. This is the man who is so much aligned with him that he's taken the same name, Photius II. He presented his congratulations to his successor, Benjamin I. So this is clearly interacting with these people as though they were actually something, which they're not. Not in terms of being members of any kind of a hierarchy. They might have valid orders. That's one thing, but that just makes things worse, that they have valid orders outside the church. On May 22nd, clearly Roncalli is body's actions approving of them. It's one thing if he were to interact with them for the purpose of bringing them into the church, and the church could set up after bringing back into her fold some group of schismatics could potentially set up schismatic prelates as members of the hierarchy of the church. That can happen. That has happened as a concession. Because clearly, in the mind of the church, though, clearly, someone who has received orders illicitly is not to be allowed to exercise those orders. That is clear from many other instances. But the church can do as she sees fit and can set up someone who was formerly a schismatic, ordained a priest, consecrated a bishop in schism, can set up that person as an actual bishop in the sense of jurisdiction, having actual power over to rule some part of the church, over some group of people who have been brought into the church, but that's only by way of concession. That is also clear. In fact, there was one case prominent case of that during the reign of Leo XIII, which we studied last year. But these are not people who have returned to the church. They are still in schism. They are still ruling over some schismatic sect, or at least some part of some schismatic sect, and he is interacting with them, honoring them as though they were actually something, and even congratulating successors, things like that. It's entirely too far in terms of Catholic morality, of course, but done with the purpose of promoting ecumenism. So by the time he calls Vatican II, Roncalli in 1962, he has already been interested in ecumenism and practicing it for decades by that point. On May 27th, 1939, he went to Phanard, the see of the Patriarch at Constantinople, to meet the same Benjamin I and the two gave each other a warm embrace. So somebody greeting him in an affectionate way. And as we have here in the Orthodox tradition, the kiss of peace, the embrace, has a high symbolic value. So it's not just a way of saying hello, which would be too familiar, actually, in any case, but this is a lot more than that. If it were just that, it would be a failure to observe clerical reserve and clerical etiquette, especially in someone in such a prominent position, but it's much worse than that. After such a long period of enmity, the kiss of peace between Benjamin I and Roncalli, the representative of the Pope, prefigured the embrace exchanged in January 1964 in Jerusalem by, and this is, you can see the alignment of this author here, in Jerusalem by two brother patriarchs, Athenagoras and Paul VI. So, it's Paul VI was, remember Montini, close friend of Roncalli. And as he was dying, there's a popular story that Roncalli said on his deathbed, "Stop the council." He said no such thing. That is a popular story. Somehow that rumor got started by somebody who made some claim to that effect. But on his deathbed, actually, Roncalli just talked about the fact they'll probably elect Montini after me. Not with any sense of protesting it. But remember, Montini was the one who carried things on. We've said it before that if Paul VI was the one who unfurled the sails of the Vatican II religion, John XXIII, Roncalli, was the one who took the ship out of port and set it on its way to its destination, clearly intending everything that it eventually brought about. So certainly he would have promulgated Vatican II if he'd lived a few years longer. Certainly he would. There's no question of it whatsoever. Everything was going in exactly the direction that he planned. And Paul VI just brought it to its conclusion. And that, all of this Roncalli is engaging in here gives us indications to the same effect. This is clearly what he planned to he's doing all of this in of course, really betraying the trust of Pius XI, who would never have approved of any of this. So he's clearly, when he himself becomes Pope, supposedly, he decides I'm going to make official everything that I did previously. So this happy result, this is Roncalli's most authoritative biographer, is obviously representative of the consequences of Roncalli's ecumenical method, such as has been described by the Reverend Austin Oakley, personal representative of the Archbishop of Canterbury, it's, again, in reality, not a bishop, but a Protestant layman, to the ecumenical patriarch, the first Anglican to have met him. Roncalli thought it was long due, that this kind of behavior towards schismatics was long due. One cannot hope to pull down the walls raised between Christians by their divisions, Sikh, whatever that means, but Roncalli affirmed, I look to remove a few bricks here and there. Thus, he applied, and in the same context, the maxim gutta cavat lapidem, a drop of water hollows the rock. So, that is gutta cavat lapidem, the gradual wearing down of a rock by means of drops of water. Perhaps a more popular analogy being that of boiling a frog alive. A frog in the boiling water, which, the scientific accuracy of that analogy aside, it's the same idea. Just little by little seeking to ultimately desensitize Catholics to this sort of thing. So a short time previously, February 10th, 1939, Pius XI had died. I would say it was February 9th in any case. To check that date that's given here. The apostolic delegate celebrated a mass for the dead in Istanbul. So Roncalli did that, keeping in the Latin rite only the 5 last solemn prayers at the coffin, thus portraying the departed pope as if he, too, had been an ecumenist. So keep in mind here that obviously a requiem mass offered for a pope or for a bishop is something that's much more involved than a funeral for a layman or even for a priest. There's much more that goes into it. And the 5 less solemn prayers, that is a big part of the ceremony, but that's all that he left in the Latin rite. Everything else was done probably in Turkish, but was not done according to the not done according to the Latin rite, at least not the way it's supposed to be done. And also, this what he's referring to here, of course, they did not take the body of Pius XI to Istanbul. Instead, this was done, of course, absente corpore, with the body being absent. That is a way to do a funeral mass when the body cannot be brought to the church for whatever reason, is to set up a catafalque, as it's called, a setup that looks like a coffin. It's covered in the funeral pall and everything, but there's no actual coffin, there's no actual body there. We used to do this all the time, and we would do it every All Souls Day. In previous years, we would set up a catafalque in the church in Brooksville and do the absolution just as we would do at the end of any funeral mass. Of course, it's altered slightly when there's no actual body, and especially on All Souls Day when it's done for all of the souls of the faithful departed suffering in purgatory. But it is indeed very much along the same lines as a funeral. It looks very much like a coffin, although in our case it was rather thinner than an actual coffin. But it's the same setup, very much a very similar setup. So that's what he's talking about here. He does that in an ecumenical fashion as well, and seeks to portray Pius XI as also being somehow an ecumenist, which was most definitely not the fact. So, besides Turkey, so also keep in mind here, we're looking at the reign of Pius XI was itself, again, it was the pontificate that was due to be a hardline pontificate, and it wasn't. In some ways it was, and certainly Pius XI himself was a fiery character, not given to letting anyone else walk over him, that's for sure. But all of the people he put in place were all Benedict XV people. They were all, the administration, to a great extent of his pontificate, was along accommodationist lines. And definitely his having Roncalli in place there is a part of that. Remember, during the reign of St. Pius X, Roncalli was on the list of suspects of the Sodalitium, the people who were suspect of modernism. But then during Benedict XV and the reigns of Benedict XV and Pius XI, and we'll see also most of all Pius XII, he quite the opposite, comes up through the ranks. Even if during the reign of Pius XI it's effectively being shunted off to the side, he still is technically being promoted. Because the fact of the matter is that, yes, it is possible to remove someone by promoting him, but objectively a promotion is still a promotion. Sometimes, yes, it can have the immediate effect of getting somebody out of a situation, but ultimately it is still a promotion. So some people need to be just gotten rid of simpliciter. And sometimes they're not. They're really for diplomatic reasons. That the idea is you just don't do that to somebody of high standing. The way you can get rid of someone in high standing is to promote him technically while effectively getting him out of the way. But that can have other effects as well. Obviously, a promotion can lead to further promotions. So the apostolic delegate, we said that, celebrated the Mass for the dead in Istanbul. Besides Turkey, Roncalli also had to concern himself with Greece, the country with the most severe anti-Catholic legislation desired by the Orthodox clergy, the prohibition of proselytizing, prohibition of residency for foreign priests, the obligation to celebrate mixed marriages before an Orthodox minister, which of course is forbidden by the church and in fact invalid by law of the church. That there should be, that Catholics should ever get married before a non-Catholic minister is forbidden. Absolutely forbidden. So in case of any mixed marriages, the Catholic priest who oversees it, and there's never permission given to get married before a non-Catholic minister. So all these problems do indeed exist in Greece. Roncalli is to try to deal with it. There to Greece came Roncalli, who would prepare, or could prepare, a modus vivendi with the government, so a way of trying to get along with them, provoking the anti-papism of the Greeks, who urged a meeting with the London Anglicans. Out of those Athens meetings would come the recognition of the validity of the holy orders, quote-unquote, of the Anglican Church, sect really, against which Leo XIII had already pronounced. So this is I remember the Novus Ordo, there was some years ago, the idea was floating around that maybe Anglican orders are partially valid, whatever that's supposed to mean. But that idea was floated a while ago. And imagine this, the justification for that was that, well, we talk about having partial communion with the Church of Christ, or partial communion with the Catholic Church. So why could you not have, therefore, partially valid orders? So it's got a certain internal logic to it, those kinds of crazy ideas, but just ultimately that just goes to show the absurdity of the Vatican II ecclesiology, that they appeal to that. There may have even been mention of possibly partially valid marriages or something. It's all perfectly absurd. Sacrament is either valid or it's not. Even in the case of doubtful sacraments whose conferral is doubtfully valid, ultimately it either was conferred or it wasn't. Just the doubt exists in the mind. We are unable to determine whether it was validly conferred or not. But that's the reason why, in the case of, say, a doubtful baptism, that has to be conferred conditionally, because that could have been valid. In other words, you might, when you conditionally baptize somebody who was doubtfully baptized, you might be baptizing someone who is in fact already baptized. You might be, in the case of people who come from Protestant sects. Sometimes Protestants validly baptize. There are cases we verified of Protestants validly baptizing. When somebody's baptized, he's baptized and cannot be rebaptized. It's a sacrilege to do so. So that's why conferring conditional baptism on someone doubtfully baptized must be conditional. The intention is only to baptize this person if the person is in fact unbaptized. Yeah, and that avoids sinning by way of irreverence against the sacrament, and at the same time ensures that if this person, in fact, his baptism was invalid, then he is actually baptized. So the minister only intends to baptize if this person is not baptized. So ultimately, though, either a sacrament is valid or it's not. The doubt exists in the mind. There are many reasons why a sacrament might be doubtful. We're not going into all of that now. But in the case of Anglican orders, there's not even a shadow of doubt as to whether it's valid or not. They're just invalid. Absolutely. Leo XIII, remember, pronounced them absolutely null and utterly void. It's not even probable opinion permissible anymore to the effect that they are valid. Remember, though, Cardinal Gaspari thought that they were valid. Cardinal Gaspari had certain issues, which we'll see. We've already seen some of them. We'll see more of them later on. The Anglicans, as well as the Orthodox, awaited a negative reaction from the delegate, a recalling of the judgment of Pope Leo. They did not take into account the extraordinary capacity that Roncalli possessed for swallowing indignities. So Bishop Roncalli, who did not intervene officially in the question of mixed marriages, unless to nuance, this is the quotation we're looking at here, unless to nuance the bellicose positions of certain people, meaning Catholics, anybody who actually understands the necessity of observing the laws of the Church concerning marriage. So Roncalli only gets involved in this question of this imposition in Greece of the policy of having mixed marriages, the case of a Catholic marrying a schismatic, that must be done before a schismatic priest. So Roncalli only gets involved to nuance the bellicose positions of bellicose Catholics who are crying about the encroachment of the state and about persecution. And he was not caught napping in this. He said, "I am not complaining about the fact that the separated brethren have made the first step toward unity." So, ecumenism is a good thing, in other words. Of course, if schismatics actually move towards reuniting with the Church, that is a good thing, but that's not what he's saying here. Again, remember, Roncalli, typically modernist fashion, has a way of saying things that sometimes at least can be taken well, can be taken correctly, and if should need arise, can say, "Oh, I meant that correctly," without actually meaning it correctly. That's you can see that in the Novus Ordo all the time. Pronouncements by the Novus Ordo, pronouncements from Bergoglio, things that statements in which there might not be any explicitly heretical statement, but the overall tone of it is heretical, certainly. And the bottom line, the take-home message, call it what you will, the definite impression left by it is a heretical conclusion. So decidedly, the Roman delegate was beyond them. Back up. Anglican London and Orthodox Athens regarded him, Roncalli, with astonishment. Decidedly, the Roman delegate was beyond them. So no doubt he surpassed them, since the only interventions of the papal representative were directed against Catholics who protested, and not against the heretics, also schismatics, who persecuted and made alliances. So when we have this meeting here between schismatics and Anglicans, which they decide that, Anglican orders are valid, never mind what Pope Leo XIII said previously, Roncalli does not protest against that. So did Roncalli's silence at least obtain the famous modus vivendi that would have lightened the persecution? Not at all, in fact. Father Tanzella himself, this is one of the other authors that Father Ricosa quotes, not the most prominent, but one of them, several lines later, after previous quotations we've mentioned, reports that the modus vivendi, already prepared in Rome, remained in Rome. So in other words, Roncalli's only accomplishment in all of this is getting people used to ecumenical practices. And that's that. So, upon the death of Pius XII in 1958, Dom Lambert Baudouin confided, "If they elect Roncalli, all will be saved. He would be capable of convoking a council and consecrating ecumenism." Well, clearly, people who actually knew Roncalli knew that that's what he intended to do in calling a council, in other words. So, we've pretty well finished with Roncalli's career in Bulgaria and Turkey at this point. And now we're going on to his, we already talked about, we started this whole section talking about his being called to Paris by Pius XII in 1944. And so now we're trying to bring all this to wrap up our study of Roncalli's career, at least as it was during the reign of Pius XII. So we're moving ahead here because of that. His father Louis Bouillet writes, when Bishop Roncalli had been feted, celebrated, ushered in as nuncio in Paris in a passably unnoticed fashion, Dom Baudouin had gone to pay him a visit, not without wondering if Joseph, so Giuseppe, remember, Roncalli is usually referred to as Angelo Roncalli, but sometimes you see Giuseppe Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli. Dom Baudouin goes to visit him, wondering if Roncalli, with ring on his finger and purple robes on his back, would still recognize his humiliated brother. So he didn't remain long in his doubt. So we have the whole history of Dom Baudouin. We'd have to study all of that as well. I'm just trying to wrap this up. But Baudouin, who had been one of the people who was censored to some degree during the reign of Pius XII, but perhaps not enough, but still had undergone certain disciplines, certain disciplinary measures, goes to visit Roncalli now, wondering if he would still remember me. He didn't remain long in his doubt. Scarcely had his card been presented, but that he heard from the antechamber the well-known voice, "Lamberto, come." So, very friendly on the part of Roncalli there. One moment later, he experienced one of those warm embraces that would become famous. This is good Pope John, or future quote-unquote good Pope John we're talking about. Before he knew what was happening, he heard the nuncio say to him, "Here, sit down there and tell us your adventures." Amiably pushed, he climbed up backwards a step and found himself installed on a particularly august seat. His questioner took a seat on a chair facing him, and out of breath from laughing, he, Dom Baudouin, began the recital of his Roman tribulations, realizing little by little that he was doing it from the height of the papal throne, which necessarily decorated the living quarters of the legates. So they never imagined then that this jocular situation after the event would become symbolic. So that's Roncalli. The big thing here is Roncalli still is friendly with the ecumenist Dom Baudouin, which really should not surprise us at all. But he is still very much so, while he's in Paris. Sorry, and not in Paris at this point. Never mind that. This is upon the death of Pius XII. But even after he's gone up through all the ranks himself, obviously in 1958, that's not the case. So he, yes. Sorry, no. Once again, that visit was in Paris, but 1958, Dom Baudouin, still alive, says that. So. If the ecumenist Dom Baudouin was an old friend, what could be said of the defrocked and excommunicated head of the Modernists, Ernesto Bonaiuti, the former seminarian companion who had assisted him at his first mass? So, yes, the one who was excommunicated, as we said before, by Benedict XV for denying the real presence of Christ in the Holy Eucharist. He was another friend, this Bonaiuti, we saw before, another old friend, very old friend of Roncalli. During his first illness, Bonaiuti's illness leading to his death, Cardinal Gasparri had given Bonaiuti a hasty absolution, another problem with Cardinal Gasparri, without a previous recantation by the penitent, provoking the just indignation of the Holy Office, or patient, actually, it's true, he's not penitent. In this case, just a patient, provoking the just indignation of the Holy Office. But on April 26, 1946, while Roncalli was in Paris, Bonaiuti died in Italy without the sacraments and without repenting. So what was the reaction of his friend Roncalli? He recalled the exact moment of Bonaiuti's death and the desire expressed by the dying man to open the windows so that he could hear the sounds of the bells of Easter. Then he, Roncalli, commented with words that were compassionate, even affectionate. So he died at 65, said Roncalli, sine luce et sine cruce, without candles or crucifix. And that refers to the setup for, of course, for a sick call, or the bringing of the sacraments, extreme unction, of course, Holy Viaticum. And yes, he dies without repenting, ultimately, Bonaiuti. And so sine luce et sine cruce, without the candles or the crucifix, employed by a priest bringing the sacraments to someone for the last time. That's the idea. So this is something to be compassionate towards him about. And certainly, yes, that is a misfortune, but the reason is, remember, that he died impenitent. And sometimes, yes, people die, most unfortunately, without a chance to receive the sacraments, the last sacraments, extreme unction, Holy Viaticum, which is, of course, Holy Communion, but especially for the purpose of fortifying the person for his final journey into eternity. Hence it is called Viaticum. Referring to the way into eternity, departing this earth. And it's an instance of someone being allowed to receive Holy Communion more than once a day. If he's already received Holy Communion earlier in the day, suddenly meets a terrible accident or something and is dying, he may receive, together with extreme unction, Holy Viaticum as well, even though he's already received Holy Communion earlier that day. So that's there are other instances of people being allowed to receive Holy Communion more than once, and exceptionally. Probably the most commonly occurring is that of a priest who has to binate, say, Mass more than once on a day on a Sunday. That's an instance of course, the priest must receive Holy Communion at each Mass that he celebrates. So that is a case of also receiving Holy Communion more than once, but that's exceptional. But all that's really incidental to what we're talking about here. Much more edifying to consider than what we're looking at here. But back to Bonaiuti's death and Roncalli's commentary on it. Roncalli says his admirers have written that he was a deeply and intensely religious spirit, adhering to Christianity with every fiber of his being, bound by unbreakable bonds to his beloved Catholic Church. Obviously not, in reality. He denies the real presence, is excommunicated for it, and never repents. He's cut off from the Church in many different ways. He is, of course, losing the virtue of faith, as far as we can possibly tell, how we make an argument that he could have possibly been in good faith in denying the real presence to begin with. It's hard to make a case to that effect. Having received seminary training prior to Vatican II, certainly he would have been familiar with that, with the actual teaching of the Catholic Church concerning the real presence. Then also, yes, refusing to repent any time before dying. Dying excommunicated and defrocked, laicized. He does not adhere to Christianity with every fiber of his being, has not only not bound by unbreakable bonds, but in fact dying with his bonds to the Catholic Church severed by the authority of the Church. Naturally, there was no priest to bless the body, and no church welcomed him for his funeral. Words from his spiritual testament between March 18th and 19th, 1946. I may have made mistakes. This is Bonaiuti. I may have made mistakes, but I can find nothing in the substance of my teaching to retract or disavow. Not even denying the real presence, for example, along with other problems. But then Roncalli's final remark is Dominus parcat illi, so may the Lord spare him. Of course, yes, still pray. There's always a chance that someone has repented at the last moment without our knowing it, but to speak of him so nicely like this is problematic, to say the least. And also John, referring to John the 23rd, Roncalli's biographer comments, John always gave Bonaiuti his priestly title. He remained Don Ernesto. And the focus is on the Don here, not Ernesto. That's not unusual. That was his first name, of course, but it's actually that's not unusual in Italian. It's not like saying Father Bob, for example. It's normal. Don plus the priest's first name. That's just customary. Always was customary in Italy to do that. So Catholic scholars were already writing the history of modernism, and it would soon become possible to present Bonaiuti as a prophet of renewal. This is in Roncalli's biographer. John would have welcomed this trend. His last words on Bonaiuti were an absolution. And Father Ricosa comments, well, they certainly weren't a condemnation. Whatever you want to call that, it's not a condemnation. So that's, remember, everything with this, Roncalli's biographer says carries significant authority as being certainly the most authoritative biography of John the 23rd, remember, always of at least official character. Whether you could say this is the official one, perhaps not. You can make a case one way or the other, depending on different things that were said about it, or the ways in which it was published. But certainly the most authoritative, and to be taken as the most important biography of him. So Catholic progressivism, a rerun of modernism, which of course we're studying in the Modern Errors course. We're not going to go into all of that, which is good for us. We need to bring all this to wrap up all this eventually, in any case. Bonaiuti was dead, but modernism was not. So as you no doubt are discovering now, St. Pius X had condemned it, and condemned modernism with the encyclical Pascendi, which we've seen, at least large parts of it. He had tried to drive out the fomenters who hypocritically hid their adherence to this heresy because modernism seeks to gnaw at the church from within. The death of St. Pius X in 1914 and World War I had diverted attention from the enemy, considered it prematurely as dead and buried. Of course, modernists were keen to make it seem that way. You may, whenever you come across mentions of the new theology people, whenever they mention modernism, they talk about that as something very definitely and firmly in the past. They talk about modernists as, of course, the people among whom they are not to be numbered, but they'll say things like, well, yes, modernism was bad and was to be condemned, certainly, but the questions were never answered. Say things like that. Clearly because they actually have those same ideas, but they remember what happened the last time those ideas were put forward clearly. So between the two wars, modernism and its more or less conscious abettors cautiously raised its head. So we said before, some more or less conscious, some were very definitely conscious. Others, some people who are listed as having contributed to it in one way or another to the new theology by people who themselves are in favor of it, may or may not have been aware of what they may have been contributing to, and sometimes whatever contributions they may have given seem to be, that might be a bit of a stretch sometimes, you think, reading, well, this person contributed in this way. It seems a bit of a stretch sometimes, but in any case, more or less conscious abettors, yes, some people may have been involved in this knowing what they were doing, others perhaps not so much, and perhaps having been taken in by the things these people were saying, Because remember, they start saying things like, "Oh, we're going back to the sources." Ressourcement. You may be familiar with that term at this point. This claim, anyway, of going back to the sources. Sometimes that's why you can have modernists who claim to be Thomists. What they claim is they're going back to the sources of Thomism, to the historical Thomas, as though there were a contradiction between that and what St. Thomas says as presented by more recent Thomists. They say we're going back to the historical Thomas, and they like to say things like there's along the similar lines of saying there's a Christ of faith and a Christ of history, and the Christ of faith, well, that's is of him that we believe everything in the Gospels, but there's a Christ of history. So did all that really happen? And they make a similar distinction. Some of them, anyway, those who care, they say who want to retain the title of Thomist. When I want to retain that label, they'll say, "Oh, yes, we're going back to the Thomas of history." In essence, that's what they're saying. Although when you actually read St. Thomas, he says exactly what, for example, Garrigou says that he says. And other more recent Thomists who are actually faithful to St. Thomas, who actually deserve the title. So the objective of these modernists, of the reheated version of it, remained the same: modernize the church, bring it up to date. Still want to do the exact same thing. Adapt it to progress and modern civilization. That is the 80th proposition condemned by the Syllabus of Errors of Pius IX. Unable to present themselves openly as they were, the modernists pushed dogmatic questions to the background and endeavored to spread their ideas by pastoral means. Modern man is far from the church. So this is why they got into, they hijacked, they claimed anyway, that they were continuing the liturgical movement begun by St. Pius X. So that was what we see getting into the sacred liturgy on the part of the modernists, which by this point they are. We haven't examined it yet, but they are most definitely around this time. 1948 was the date at which the first memos went out, beginning getting things in order for the Novus Ordo. So they're very active during the reign of Pius XII. But it was very clever of the modernists to get into the sacred liturgy and to try to use that as a vehicle for their heresies, because that way they could say, well, this has nothing to do with we're not teaching anything. At least they could avoid being detected as teaching anything, but actually, in fact, teach very effectively their evil ideas by effecting liturgical changes in accordance with them. Not to say that anything during the reign of Pius XII that was promulgated to the entire church could have possibly been intrinsically evil, but they switched over to that very cleverly, because one thing, it's a way of camouflaging what they think, and also they claim that they're just following the will of St. Pius X, versus the Pope, who was the most anti-modernist of all. Both in practice and in theory and in practice, not only condemned it, condemnations which were reiterated by subsequent popes, but who are not nearly as anti-modernists in practice, did not seek to stamp it out, not nearly to the same extent. So it was very clever of the modernists to claim that they were just following a program begun by the great anti-modernist pope. That because, true, St. Pius X brought about various liturgical changes, which were very good. For one thing, he brought about an excellent balance between the temporal cycle and the sanctural cycle. There used to be, say, Pope Leo XIII loaded up the calendar with a great many saints' feasts, to the point that seeing ferial psalms, for example, became something relatively rare. All the saints' feasts that we have, lower-ranking feasts, which we sing ferial psalms. Previously, all of that was taken just from the common of different saints. Just as there's a common in the Missal, there's also a common in the Breviary. And we refer to that all the time when singing the office, but for Vespers, for example, only from the chapter onwards most days. And you take these ferial psalms for the ferial antiphons and psalms for the first part. Previously, and they still exist, still in the Breviary, and they are to be employed on occasion, but rarely. Anything else is to be employed, I should say. Just keep it simple. Anything else is employed relatively rarely, but those are all same antiphons and Sunday psalms. So that means every day prior to St. Pius X, every single day in which we have a saint's feast, we would, during the reign of Leo XIII, at the time in which we were living, we'd be singing or reciting Sunday psalms all those days. So that means sometimes you'd see that you could go for a very long time without seeing a single ferial psalm, potentially. And also the ranks, the way that the ranking worked on Sundays was that Sundays, or at least most Sundays, your regular Sunday, for lack of a better term, is a semi-double, and that just falls into the ranking of any other day that's a semi-double. So it means if you have a saint's feast is a double falling on a Sunday, then the Sunday gets reduced to a commemoration. You have that saint's feast on a Sunday. So that's how it was previously. Most St. Pius X, in other words, introduced the rules of simplification of certain saints' feasts, which sometimes results in a rather odd order of commemorations at Vespers on Saturday and Sunday. That's been coming up with the Ordo project. I'll get comments sometimes. The order of commemorations here seems odd, but according to all the rules, we always investigate such things. Anybody brings up such a concern, we always investigate it. But many times the answer is simply, yes, that is strange, but it's according to all of the rules. So at least, in other words, according to those rules, at least a double or double major is reduced effectively to the rank of a simple. Not 100%, because it still gets commemorated at first and second Vespers. Simple feasts have only first Vespers, they end at noon. They only have one set of Vespers, and that begins the evening before the feast. Whereas, for example, if you have a feast it's the apparition of St. Michael, for example, a double major falling on a Sunday, that gets simplified. That's happened before. That gets simplified, so you treat it so it doesn't bump with Sunday, which is definitely not the rank of double major when that occurs. It doesn't bump the Sunday, but it gets commemorated as though it were a simple. So that means after everything else. It can, yes. You can end up, you think it might be some other feast. I think St. Michael should be before that one, but not in that case, because it's been simplified. So all of this was introduced by St. Pius X. There's some examples of things that St. Pius X did. It was very good. The Modernists said when they got into getting into things during the reign of Pius XII, or perhaps even before, they started saying, so all we're doing here is we're just getting involved in this great liturgical reform begun by St. Pius X. We can all agree that was very good, right? So we're getting involved in that. Meanwhile, they're introducing modernism, modernist ideas. So that's what they claim to this day. Don't be surprised when you hear that, oh yes, the liturgical reform that brought about the Novus Ordo Missae began with St. Pius X. Don't be surprised if you hear that, because that is the claim. That began the liturgical movement.